There's a photograph that was never meant to exist, taken in 1987 by a maintenance worker who was fired 3 days later. It shows something that contradicts everything the British royal family has ever told us about their wealth. In the image, barely visible through morning fog, stands a mansion. Not just any mansion. This one has 42 rooms, sits on 300 acres of prime Scottish Highland, and according to every official record you could ever find, it doesn't exist. The negatives were confiscated. The photographer signed documents he's legally bound to never discuss. But copies survived, passed between researchers and historians in whispers, because this mansion, this invisible piece of the Windsor Empire, represents something far larger than a simple country house. It represents a truth that the British monarchy has spent over a century carefully obscuring. The royal family doesn't just own what they show you. What they show you is barely the beginning. Let me take you back to a moment that most people have forgotten. It's 1936, and King Edward VIII has just abdicated the throne. The official story, the one everyone knows, revolves around his love affair with Wallis Simpson, an American divorcee deemed unsuitable to be queen. It's romantic in a tragic sort of way, a king who gave up everything for love. But here's what they don't tell you in the history books. When Edward abdicated, he didn't just walk away from the crown, he walked away with a fortune. Paintings, jewels, properties that had been moved into his name over the years, transferred through legal mechanisms so complex that even today, researchers struggle to untangle them. And one of those properties was an estate in France, a sprawling compound near Biarritz that officially belonged to a shell company registered in Luxembourg. Edward lived comfortably in exile, but the property records tell a different story. They tell a story of wealth that flows like water, moving through channels invisible to the public eye. The Windsor family, you see, learned something crucial in the early 20th century. They learned that visibility equals vulnerability. When people can see your wealth, they can question it, they can tax it, they can demand you justify it. So the family did what any rational group of people sitting on incomprehensible wealth would do. They made most of it disappear. Not literally, of course. The mansions still stand, the land still generates income, the investments still grow, but they disappear from public view, tucked away behind corporate structures, held in trusts, managed by the duchies of Lancaster and Cornwall in ways that exploit every legal loophole ever written into British law. Start with what you think you know. You know about Buckingham Palace, obviously. 320 rooms in the heart of London, the official residence. The one with the guards and the tourists, and the balcony where the family waves during celebrations. You know about Windsor Castle, the oldest and largest occupied castle in the world, weekends and state occasions, all very official and grand. You probably know about Sandringham House in Norfolk, the private country retreat where the family spends Christmas. Maybe you know about Balmoral Castle in Scotland, where they summer, where Princess Diana spent her final days before Paris, where the family retreats to grieve away from cameras. These are the properties they want you to know about. These are the acceptable face of royal wealth. But here's the thing. These properties, the visible ones, they're just the tip of an iceberg so massive that if the British public truly understood its scope, there would be riots in the streets. Because beneath the surface, extending down into depths that most people never even consider, lies a property empire that spans continents, generates hundreds of millions in annual revenue, and operates with a level of secrecy that would make Swiss bankers jealous. Let's start with Balmoral, since we've already mentioned it. The official estate, the one you see in photographs, covers about 50,000 acres. That's the number they give you. 50,000 acres of Scottish Highlands, forests and rivers and mountains purchased by Prince Albert for Queen Victoria in 1852. It's presented as this romantic retreat, the place where the royal family goes to be normal, to hike and fish and exist away from the pressures of public life. And that part is true. But here's what they don't tell you. The Balmoral estate is just the center of a web of properties that extends across northeastern Scotland like a spider's web. There are at least 7 other significant properties, houses and lodges and hunting estates, all within a 50-mile radius, all connected to the Windsor family through various mechanisms, and none of them appearing on any official list of royal properties. Take Abergeldy Castle, for instance. It sits right next to Balmoral, separated by less than 2 miles. For over a century and a half, the royal family leased this castle, used it to house guests and staff, treated it functionally as an extension of Balmoral itself. But it wasn't owned by the Crown. It was leased from the Gordon family, and when that lease expired in 2023, suddenly there was all this news coverage about the royal family losing access to this property. Except here's the interesting part. Properties don't just stop being useful because a lease expires. Money changes hands, new arrangements get made, and Abergeldy Castle, despite the official end of the lease, remains functionally available to the royal family through mechanisms that aren't part of the public record. Then there's Delnadamp Lodge, about 18 miles from Balmoral. On paper, it's owned by a trust. That trust is managed by a law firm in Edinburgh. That law firm has represented the royal family's interests for decades. The Basina Lodge itself is used irregularly, maintained year-round by staff whose salaries are paid by the trust. And on the rare occasions when it's occupied, the occupants arrive in vehicles that are kept at Balmoral. Connect the dots however you like, but this property, for all practical purposes, functions as a private overflow facility for the main estate. And it continues. Birkhall, officially, is the private residence of King Charles. It's about 8 miles from Balmoral Castle, and Charles purchased it decades ago. But here's the nuance. The property was purchased with funds from the Duchy of Cornwall, which means it was purchased with money that technically belongs to the heir to the throne, not to Charles personally. Now that Charles is king, Birkhall has passed to Prince William as part of the duchy holdings, but it's still used by Charles when he's in Scotland. The property technically changed hands, but functionally, nothing changed. It's a shell game, moving ownership around on paper while maintaining absolute continuity of use. There are others. Craiggowan Lodge on the Balmoral estate proper, used regularly but rarely photographed. Corgarth Castle, technically a historic ruin managed by Historic Environment Scotland, but sitting on land owned through duchy holdings. Ballochby Forest, purchased by Queen Victoria, officially part of Balmoral, but managed separately, generating timber income that flows through different accounting channels. Each property, each parcel of land, is a thread in a tapestry so complex that even property researchers who specialize in royal holdings will tell you they're not entirely sure where Balmoral ends and other holdings begin. Now, you might be thinking, okay, so the royal family owns a lot of property in Scotland. They're wealthy, we knew that. But you're missing the crucial point. It's not just about owning property. It's about the systematic way that property is obscured, the deliberate architecture of opacity that surrounds these holdings. Because if the public knew the full extent of what the family owns, if they could see the complete picture, they'd start asking very uncomfortable questions about taxation, about fairness, about whether a modern democratic nation should really be supporting this level of private wealth accumulation in a single family. Move south to Sandringham. The official story is that Sandringham House is a private residence purchased by Queen Victoria for Edward VII when he was Prince of Wales. 20,000 acres of Norfolk countryside, purchased in 1862 for $220,000. It's presented as a beloved family home, private property, distinct from the Crown estates. The Queen, later King Charles, pays for its upkeep personally. It's not supported by taxpayers. See how reasonable that sounds? See how it deflects criticism? But Sandringham House, the main residence you see in photographs, sits at the center of an estate that's far more complex than the official narrative suggests. The 20,000 acres include 10 separate farms, several residential properties that are rented out, commercial woodlands that generate timber revenue, and a fruit farm that supplies high-end markets in London. Then there's Anmer Hall, a 10-bedroom mansion on the Sandringham estate that Prince William and Catherine use as their country home. It was gifted to them by the Queen, a gift that in any other context would trigger inheritance taxes, but because it's transferred within the royal family and remains technically part of the Sandringham estate, no taxes are paid. There's Park House, where Diana Spencer grew up, right on the Sandringham estate, rented to Diana's father. When Diana died, there was talk of turning it into a memorial, but instead it became a hotel for Leonard Cheshire Disability, a charity. Noble purpose, certainly, but the property was leased, not donated, generating ongoing income for the estate while providing excellent public relations. There's Wood Farm, where Prince Philip spent his final years, a relatively modest 5-bedroom cottage compared to the other properties, but still significant, still private, still off-limits to anyone without explicit invitation. And then there are the properties that connect to Sandringham through less obvious channels. Flitcham Abbey, about 3 miles from Sandringham House, has been used by various minor royals over the years, always described as being nearby, but never explicitly connected to the estate, though research into the property records reveals ownership through a trust that traces back to duchy holdings. There's Appleton House, another nearby property associated with the royal family, used by various members over the decades, always private, always discreet. The pattern becomes clear when you look at it from above, metaphorically speaking. The royal family doesn't just own a house in some land, they control entire regions. In Norfolk, in Scotland, they own enough property that they essentially function as feudal lords, the largest private landowners in areas where their influence shapes local economies, where their decisions about land use affect entire communities, where their wealth grows invisibly, year after year, shielded from the public scrutiny that would attach to any other family with comparable holdings. But here's where it gets really interesting. Here's where we move from properties that are at least vaguely acknowledged to exist into territory that the royal family absolutely does not want you thinking about. The duchies, the Duchy of Lancaster and the Duchy of Cornwall. These are the mechanisms through which the real wealth operates, the engines that generate hundreds of millions in annual income, the structures that make the Windsor family one of the wealthiest families in Europe, while maintaining the public fiction that they're simple public servants living modestly on a civil list. The Duchy of Lancaster belongs to the sovereign. Right now, that's King Charles. It's a portfolio of lands, properties, and investments worth approximately £650 million, generating an annual income of about £24 million. That money goes directly to the monarch, tax-free, private income that's separate from the sovereign grant, separate from any public funding. The Duchy of Cornwall belongs to the heir to the throne, currently Prince William. It's worth approximately £1 billion, generates about £21 million annually, and again, that money flows directly to William, private income, minimally taxed through arrangements that ordinary citizens couldn't dream of accessing. Now, the official explanation for these duchies is historical. They date back to medieval times, created to provide income for the sovereign and the heir so they wouldn't be dependent on the nobility or parliament. Fair enough, that made sense in 1337 when the Duchy of Cornwall was created. But we're not living in 1337 anymore. We're living in 2025, and these medieval institutions persist, generating modern wealth, exploiting modern markets, operating with a level of financial opacity that would be illegal for any other entity. Let's dig into what the duchies actually own, because the official summaries are deliberately vague. The Duchy of Lancaster owns approximately 18,000 hectares of land across England and Wales. But it's not just farmland. The duchy owns commercial properties in central London, office buildings, retail spaces, properties that rent for millions per year. It owns entire villages in Yorkshire and Lancashire. It owns development land on the outskirts of growing cities, land that increases in value as urban areas expand, land that generates income not just through rent but through appreciation. The duchy owns a portfolio of financial investments, stocks and bonds and derivatives, managed by professional investment firms, growing wealth through market mechanisms exactly like any other ultra-wealthy family, except with tax advantages that effectively amount to state subsidy. When the duchy makes a profit, that money flows to the monarch personally. When the duchy needs legal protection, it gets represented by lawyers who argue, successfully, that the duchy is neither a corporation nor a private estate, but something unique, something that deserves special treatment under law. Here's a specific example that illustrates how this works. The Savoy estate in London is owned by the Duchy of Lancaster. You know the Savoy Hotel, one of the most prestigious hotels in London. The land under that hotel, the land under the surrounding buildings, belongs to the duchy. The annual rent from that land alone runs into millions. But because the Duchy of Lancaster isn't classified as a corporation, it doesn't pay corporate taxes. Because it's not classified as a private estate, it doesn't pay inheritance taxes. It exists in a legal gray zone, a medieval anachronism perpetuated into the modern era, because it benefits one family enormously, and because the political will to challenge it has never materialized. The Duchy of Cornwall is even more extensive. It owns approximately 53,000 hectares across 23 counties, primarily in the southwest of England, but with holdings scattered across the country. It owns farmland and forests, but also urban properties, rental housing, commercial real estate. It owns beaches and marinas. It owns the seabed rights off parts of the Cornish coast, which means anyone wanting to develop offshore wind farms or marine projects has to negotiate with the duchy, has to pay the duchy, enriching the heir to the throne with every transaction. Dartmoor Prison, one of Britain's most notorious maximum security prisons, sits on Duchy of Cornwall land. The duchy leases the land to the Ministry of Justice, generating steady, reliable income from, essentially, the incarceration of criminals. There's something deeply troubling about that, isn't there? The future king profiting from the punishment of society's outcasts. But it's legal. It's been the arrangement for centuries, and it continues because these medieval structures persist regardless of modern sensibilities. The duchy owns the Oval Cricket Ground in London, not the buildings, but the land underneath. It owns large portions of Kennington in South London, residential properties that would be worth hundreds of millions if sold, but instead generate rental income year after year. It owns Restermel Manor in Cornwall, used occasionally by Prince William, but primarily generating income through commercial activities on the estate. It owns Poundbury, an experimental new town built on duchy land near Dorchester, a planned community that's either a visionary example of new urbanism or a vanity project depending on who you ask, but regardless, a development that enriches the duchy through land sales and ongoing rents. And here's the thing that really matters. When people talk about the royal family's wealth, they usually cite estimates in the range of £500 million to £1 billion for the family's private wealth. But those estimates almost always exclude the full value of the duchies because the duchies are classified as corporate entities, separate from the individuals who benefit from them. It's the accounting trick, a way of making the wealth appear smaller than it is. If you actually calculated the Windsor family's wealth the way you'd calculate any other family's wealth, including the present value of income streams they control, the full value of properties they have exclusive use of, the investment portfolios they manage, you'd be looking at figures in the range of £3 billion to $5 billion. That's not speculation. That's based on public records, property values, disclosed income streams. The royal family is far wealthier than they want you to believe. But we're still talking about properties that at least exist in public records, even if their full significance is obscured. Let's go deeper. Let's talk about the properties that truly are hidden, the ones that take real digging to uncover. In 1952, when Elizabeth became queen, her private secretary was a man named Sir Alan Lascelles. Lascelles was old-school aristocracy, a man who understood that the monarchy's survival depended on managing its public image while protecting its private interests. One of his early priorities was establishing what he called private refuges, properties where the royal family could retreat completely away from any possibility of public observation. These weren't just country houses. These were properties specifically chosen and developed for maximum privacy, places where even the staff were minimal, where security could be absolute, where the family could exist entirely outside the public eye. One of these properties is in the Scottish Highlands, about 40 miles from Balmoral, accessible only by a single-track road that's gated and monitored. It doesn't have a name that appears in any official registry. Property researchers refer to it as the Cairngorms Lodge, but that's descriptive, not official. It's a substantial stone house built in the Victorian era, sitting on about 5,000 acres of mountain and forest. It's maintained year-round by a small staff who live in cottages on the property. The royal family uses it perhaps 2 or 3 times a year, always briefly, always without announcement. The property is owned through a trust established in 1958, managed by a legal firm in Aberdeen, and the beneficiaries of that trust are listed only as the private interests of the sovereign and immediate family. How do we know this property exists? Because people live near it. Because maintenance workers have spoken carefully off the record. Because property records, while obscure, aren't completely invisible if you know what to look for and have the time to search. And because occasionally, very occasionally, someone sees something. A helicopter landing where helicopters shouldn't land, vehicles with specific markings, security presence that seems excessive for a private estate. There's another property in Wales, in Snowdonia, that serves a similar purpose. It was purchased in the 1960s through an intermediary, ostensibly as an investment property, but it's never been rented, never been open to the public, and is used exclusively by the royal family. It's not large, perhaps 20 rooms, but it's isolated, surrounded by mountains, accessible only by a road that passes through a working farm that also happens to be owned by the same trust. The arrangement provides natural security, a legitimate reason for the road to be private, a buffer between the property and any curious outsiders. In Norfolk, there are at least 3 properties beyond the main Sandringham estate that function as private refuges. One is a converted mill house on the edge of the Wash, the large estuary on England's east coast. It's described in local records as a private residence, no names attached, but the property is surrounded by Sandringham land, and people who've lived in the area for decades will tell you, quietly, that they've seen Princess Anne there, that they've seen Andrew there in years past, that it's understood locally to be a royal family property, even if the official records don't say so explicitly. These hidden properties serve multiple purposes: privacy, obviously, but also security. If something were to happen, if there were a genuine national emergency, a terrorist threat, a revolution, God forbid, these properties represent refuges, places where the family could retreat, could hide, could wait out danger. They're insurance policies in real estate form. And they exist in that gray zone of official deniability, owned through structures complex enough that casual investigation won't reveal them, but not so secret that they're illegal or truly clandestine. Now let's talk about the international properties, because the Windsor wealth doesn't stop at Britain's borders. The royal family has, over the decades, accumulated properties and financial interests across the world, and these are even more carefully obscured than the domestic holdings. Start with Canada. As monarch of Canada, Charles technically owns all crown land in Canada, though that's largely ceremonial. But the royal family also has private holdings in Canada, properties purchased over the decades through Canadian subsidiaries of duchy investment portfolios. There's a property in British Columbia on Vancouver Island, purchased in the 1970s, officially owned by an investment trust based in Toronto, but the beneficial owners, if you trace through the corporate structures, connect back to duchy interests. It's used rarely, maybe once every few years, but it's maintained and ready, a North American refuge if ever needed. There are properties in the Caribbean, inherited remnants of the colonial era that were never fully divested. In Barbados, for instance, there's a plantation house that technically belongs to the Barbadian government, but is leased long-term to a trust that maintains it as a historical property. That trust has connections to duchy management firms. The property is used occasionally for private visits, not official ones, visits that don't appear in the court circular, the official record of royal activities. In Jamaica, there are similar arrangements, properties that exist in legal limbo between public historical assets and private interests. Perhaps most interestingly, there are properties in Europe that connect to the royal family through the extended network of European aristocracy. The Windsors are related by blood and marriage to virtually every European royal house. Those relationships aren't just ceremonial. They represent networks of mutual interest, of shared wealth management, of properties that are, shall we say, available when needed. There's a property in Bavaria, a hunting lodge that belongs officially to the Ducal House of Bavaria, but which has hosted Windsor family members regularly over the decades, always privately, always discreetly. There's an estate in Denmark, owned by the Danish royal family, where Elizabeth stayed multiple times in her life, not for state visits but for private retreats. The relationship between the families means these properties function, in practical terms, as an extended network of available refuges, places where the Windsors can go and exist in absolute privacy, protected by the wealth and privilege of their aristocratic relatives. France deserves special attention. The royal family's relationship with France is complex, historically fraught, but there are properties there too. Edward VIII's estate, the one we mentioned earlier, was eventually sold, but the proceeds were managed in ways that benefited the family. There are apartments in Paris, officially owned by British investment companies, that have been used by minor royals over the years. There's a vineyard in Provence, purchased in the 1980s through an investment vehicle that traces back to duchy management, that produces wine sold commercially, but also reserves private stock for family use. The point isn't just that these properties exist, It's that they represent a level of wealth management sophistication that completely contradicts the public image of the royal family as simple public servants who happen to live in palaces. This is generational wealth accumulation operating at the highest levels, using every legal mechanism available to preserve and grow assets while minimizing public awareness and tax liability. But let's go back to Britain because there's more to uncover domestically. Let's talk about London properties beyond Buckingham Palace and Kensington Palace. The royal family maintains numerous residences in London that aren't widely publicized. Clarence House, where Charles lived before becoming king, is well known. But there are apartments in St. James's Palace occupied by minor royals, by extended family members, by people so distant from the line of succession that most Britons couldn't name them, but who nonetheless live in publicly owned properties at subsidized rates or no rent at all. There's Ivy Cottage at Kensington Palace, where Princess Eugenie lived for years. There's Nottingham Cottage, where Harry and Meghan lived before they moved to Frogmore Cottage. There's apartment 1A at Kensington Palace, where William and Catherine live, which isn't really an apartment so much as a house within a palace, 20 rooms, renovated at a cost of several £1,000,000, officially described as modest in press releases. These properties are technically owned by the Crown, managed by the royal household, but they function as private residences for family members, and the cost of maintaining them, heating them, staffing them, that cost is borne by the sovereign grant, which means by taxpayers. Then there are the properties that used to be in the royal portfolio, but were moved out to preserve wealth. Gatcombe Park, Princess Anne's residence, was purchased by the Queen in 1976 as a gift to Anne. If it had remained in the royal estate, it might have been subject to eventual public claims or inheritance considerations. By transferring it to Anne as private property, it became hers absolutely, to pass to her children, to sell if she wished, entirely outside public control. That's not illegal. That's just smart wealth management. But it's another example of how the family has systematically moved assets into private hands to ensure their long-term preservation. Bagshot Park, where Prince Edward and Sophie live, was leased from the Crown estate. The family lives there, but they don't own it, creating a situation where they have all the benefits of ownership, the privacy, the control, the use, without the costs or tax implications of actual ownership. When you map out all these arrangements, you start to see the pattern. Maximum benefit, minimum cost, constant optimization of the family's financial position. Let's talk about something that makes people uncomfortable: security costs. The royal family requires protection. That's not controversial. They're high-value targets for terrorists, for kidnappers, for anyone wanting to make a political statement. But the security costs, which run into tens of millions annually, are paid by taxpayers. That would be fine if the protection was for official duties. But the reality is that security covers private time as well. When William and Catherine are at Anmer Hall for a private family weekend, they're protected by armed police, by security systems, by rapid response teams. The cost of protecting them in their private home is borne by the public. Now multiply that across all the properties we've discussed. Every royal residence requires security infrastructure, cameras, monitoring systems, personnel. The Scottish properties need protection. The Norfolk properties need protection. The London properties need protection. And as the number of hidden or semi-private properties increases, so do the security costs, all of it paid for by taxpayers who have no idea these properties even exist. There's a bizarre contradiction at the heart of this. The royal family maintains privacy by hiding properties from public view, but they require public funding to secure those private properties. It's a transfer of wealth from the public to the private, disguised as necessary security expenditure. And it's completely legal, because Parliament has never seriously questioned these arrangements, has never demanded full transparency about what's being protected and why. The wealth management goes beyond just property. The royal family has an extensive portfolio of art, jewelry, and historical artifacts. Some of this is part of the royal collection, held in trust for the nation, theoretically public property, even if the public rarely sees most of it. But there's also a private collection, pieces that belong to the family personally, that have been passed down through generations or acquired over the years. And this private collection is valued in the hundreds of millions. When Elizabeth died, there was no inheritance tax paid on anything she left to Charles. None. Not on property, not on art, not on jewelry, not on investments. There's a specific exemption in British law for assets passing from sovereign to sovereign, justified on the grounds that the Crown's wealth needs to be preserved for the nation. But remember, much of what Elizabeth owned was private wealth, not Crown property. It was hers personally, but it passed to Charles without taxation because of this exemption. That's a transfer of wealth worth hundreds of millions, potentially over $1 billion, that would have triggered a 40% inheritance tax for any other family, but triggered nothing for the Windsors. The same will happen when Charles dies and William inherits. No inheritance tax. Another massive wealth transfer, completely tax-free, preserving generational wealth in perpetuity while ordinary British families pay 40% on anything over 325 shillings. The unfairness is staggering when you actually think about it, but it's normalized, accepted, rarely challenged because it's been this way for so long that it seems natural. Let's talk about something even more obscure, the Royal Philatelic Collection. It's one of the world's most valuable stamp collections, started by Prince Alfred in the 1860s, expanded by George V into the most comprehensive collection of British Commonwealth stamps ever assembled. It's technically private property, owned by the monarch personally, but it's so valuable that it's stored in secure vaults, insured for amounts that aren't public and could be sold for well over £100 million. It's wealth sitting in stamps, essentially an investment portfolio in miniature form, another asset that passes tax-free from sovereign to sovereign. And this is where the whole structure starts to feel almost absurd. The royal family has been accumulating wealth in every conceivable form for centuries. Land, property, art, jewelry, stamps, investments, companies, trusts, every possible vehicle for storing and growing wealth. And all of it, is managed to minimize public visibility, minimize taxation, maximize preservation across generations. It's the most sophisticated wealth management operation in Britain, perhaps in Europe, and it operates largely in secret, protected by tradition, by law, by the simple fact that most people don't think to question it. There are estates in Cornwall that were purchased centuries ago that still generate income for the duchy. There are properties in London that have been in family hands for generations, increasing in value as London has grown into one of the world's most expensive cities. There are forests in Scotland that produce timber, farms in Norfolk that produce crops, marinas in Cornwall that generate docking fees. It's an empire built over centuries, maintained through careful management, and it continues to grow even as the family's official role in governing Britain has diminished to almost nothing. Because here's the fundamental tension. The British monarchy is supposed to be a constitutional monarchy, a symbolic institution that reigns but does not rule. The actual governing is done by Parliament, by elected officials, by civil servants. The royal family's role is ceremonial, cutting ribbons, attending events, providing continuity and pageantry. They're not supposed to have real power. They're not supposed to be making political decisions or influencing policy. They're figureheads, symbols of national unity, living history. But wealth is power. Land ownership is power. The ability to influence local economies, to provide or withhold employment, to develop or preserve land, that's power. And the royal family has enormous wealth, which means they have enormous power, regardless of their official political neutrality. When the Duchy of Cornwall decides to develop land near Plymouth, that's a decision that affects thousands of people, shapes communities, changes landscapes. When the Duchy of Lancaster decides to sell property in London, that affects housing markets, affects neighborhoods. These are real decisions with real consequences, made by an institution that's accountable to no one except theoretically the monarch, who is himself accountable to no one in practice. The duchies claim they operate transparently, that they publish annual reports, that they follow all relevant regulations. And on the surface, that's true. You can find duchy annual reports. You can see general categories of holdings, overall revenue figures, broad descriptions of activities. But the details are absent. You can't see itemized lists of every property. You can't see the specific terms of leases and contracts. You can't see the full extent of investment portfolios. The transparency is surface level, enough to deflect criticism, not enough to enable real scrutiny. And this is by design. The royal family's wealth management strategy, refined over more than a century, is predicated on providing just enough information to seem open while withholding enough detail to prevent meaningful analysis. It's the art of appearing transparent while remaining opaque. And it works. Most people don't question it. Most people, if they think about royal wealth at all, probably imagine it's less than it is, probably don't realize the true scale of the empire we're talking about. Let's examine some specific cases that illustrate how this system operates in practice. In 2011, there was a controversy about rental housing owned by the Duchy of Cornwall. Investigative journalists discovered that some Duchy-owned properties were being rented to low-income families, and some of those properties were in terrible condition: mold, disrepair, health hazards. The tenants were paying rent to the Duchy, which means they were paying rent to Prince Charles, and they were living in conditions that would have been illegal for any other landlord. When this was exposed, there was brief public outrage, but the Duchy's response was masterful. They acknowledged that some properties needed improvement, committed to making repairs, emphasized that the Duchy was a responsible landlord working to maintain high standards. Within a few news cycles, the story died. But here's what didn't change. The Duchy still owns those properties. They still generate income. And while some repairs were made, the fundamental dynamic remained the same. The future king profits from rental housing, some of it occupied by people struggling financially, and this is considered normal and acceptable. In 2005, there was another controversy when it was revealed that the Queen paid no inheritance tax on the Queen Mother's estate, which was valued at about £70 million. The exemption applied because of the sovereign-to-sovereign rule, even though the Queen Mother wasn't the sovereign and Elizabeth was inheriting as daughter, not as the next sovereign. But the exemption was interpreted broadly, and no tax was paid. When this became public, there was criticism, but again, no real change resulted. The exemption remains law. The royal family continues to benefit. These incidents reveal something crucial. When specific aspects of royal wealth management are exposed and criticized, the family makes minor adjustments, offers limited reforms, waits for attention to move elsewhere. But the underlying structures never change. The duchies continue to operate with minimal transparency. The tax exemptions continue to apply. The properties continue to accumulate. The wealth continues to grow. And this brings us to a more philosophical question. Why does any of this matter? Why should anyone care how wealthy the royalty family is or how they manage their properties? They're a national institution. They provide tourism revenue. They're part of British identity and heritage. Isn't scrutinizing their wealth a bit petty? Here's why it matters. Britain is a nation with serious economic inequality. There are families living in poverty. There are children going hungry. There are people sleeping rough on London streets. At the same time, a single family, by accident of birth, controls wealth worth billions, pays minimal taxes, lives in properties worth hundreds of millions, all while being supported by public funds for their official duties. That's a moral contradiction that's hard to ignore once you really think about it. The argument for the monarchy is usually that they're net positive for Britain. They attract tourism, they provide soft diplomatic power, they represent continuity and stability. And maybe that's true. Maybe the intangible benefits of having a royal family outweigh the costs. But that argument becomes much harder to make when you understand the true extent of their private wealth and the mechanisms by which they've accumulated and preserved it. If the royal family were genuinely public servants living modestly on a public salary, sacrificing private wealth for the good of the nation, then fair enough, they deserve support. But that's not the reality. The reality is a family that has used their public position to amass private wealth on a scale that most people can't even comprehend, using legal structures that aren't available to ordinary citizens, avoiding taxes that everyone else pays, and all while maintaining the public fiction that they're just doing their duty. Let's go back to specific properties because there are more to discuss. There's Highgrove House, Charles's private residence before he became king. He purchased it in 1980 from the Duchy of Cornwall's funds for $865,000. He spent millions renovating and developing it, creating his famous organic gardens, turning it into a showcase for his environmental interests. But here's the interesting part. Highgrove generates income. The gardens are open to tours, charging substantial fees. Products from the estate, organic produce, garden items are sold commercially under the Duchy Originals brand. So Charles has a private residence that's also a commercial enterprise, generating income from his private property, income that flows through duchy structures and benefits from all the tax advantages those structures provide. When Charles became king, Highgrove passed to William as part of the Duchy of Cornwall assets, even though Charles continues to use it. Another paper transfer, ownership changing hands legally while practical control remains unchanged. It's becoming a pattern, isn't it? The appearance of change, the reality of continuity. There's Windsor in Wales, a property purchased by the Duchy of Cornwall in 2006 as a Welsh residence for Charles. It cost £1.2 million, and it's been renovated extensively. Charles uses it when in Wales, a few weeks per year. The rest of the time, it's rented out as a luxury holiday cottage, generating income for the duchy. So taxpayers don't fund this property, which sounds good, until you realize that a future king has a private residence in Wales that ordinary Welsh families could never afford, that generates commercial income when he's not using it, and that will eventually pass to William as part of the duchy assets, all outside normal taxation. These properties, Highgrove and Windsor, reveal something important about how the family thinks about real estate. Properties aren't just homes. They're assets. They're income generators. They're part of a portfolio that's actively managed to maximize financial return while serving personal needs. It's sophisticated, it's effective, and it's completely contrary to the public image of a family living in historic houses out of duty rather than choice. Let's talk about property the family has sold, because those sales are revealing too. In the 1990s, the royal family sold several properties that had been in use for decades. These sales were presented as cost-cutting measures, the family reducing their footprint, being more efficient. But look at what happened to the money. When properties owned by the duchies are sold, the proceeds go into duchy funds, where they're reinvested, where they continue to generate income for the family. When properties owned personally are sold, the proceeds are private income, and if they're reinvested wisely, they grow. Either way, the family's net wealth doesn't decrease. It just shifts form from property to investments, from visible assets to invisible ones. Sunninghill Park is an interesting example. It was given to Prince Andrew as a wedding present when he married Sarah Ferguson in 1986. The house was built on Crown land near Windsor, cost $5 million to build, and was funded by the Crown. Andrew and Sarah lived there until their divorce in 1996. After the divorce, Andrew continued to live there until 2004. Then, in 2007, Andrew sold the property to a Kazakh billionaire for $15 million, about $3 million more than its market value. The house was subsequently demolished and the land remains undeveloped. There are numerous suspicious aspects to this sale. The overmarket price suggests the buyer wasn't primarily interested in the property itself. Andrew's financial relationship with various foreign businessmen has been the subject of extensive investigation and scandal. The sale of Sunninghill Park looks very much like a payment disguised as a property transaction, a way of funneling money to Andrew in a form that appears legitimate. And Andrew kept the entire $15 million. It was his private property, so the sale proceeds were his private income. He paid capital gains tax, sure, but walked away with millions in profit from a house that had been built with public funds on Crown land given to him by his mother. That transaction encapsulates so much of what's wrong with this system. A property is given to a royal family member at public expense. That person profits privately when they sell it. The sale itself raises questions about corruption, but nothing is ever proven, and the individual keeps the money. It's privatizing public assets, profiting from position and privilege, and it's legal because the laws governing royal property were written in eras when the very concept of public accountability barely existed. Let's talk about Frogmore Cottage, since it's been in the news. Harry and Meghan were given Frogmore Cottage as a residence when they got married. The cottage on the Windsor estate needed extensive renovation, which cost about £2.4 million, paid for by the sovereign grant, which means taxpayer-funded. Harry and Meghan lived there briefly before moving to North America. There was public criticism about the renovation costs, and eventually Harry repaid the £2.4 million, but that repayment went to the sovereign grant, not to a specific renovation fund, and the property remained Crown property. Now, Frogmore Cottage is occupied by, well, depending on when you're watching this, the status might have changed, but the point is that it's a property that was renovated at great expense for one couple who barely lived there, and the taxpayer funded that renovation. If Harry hadn't repaid the costs under public pressure, that $2.4 million would have been a straight transfer from public to private benefit. And even with the repayment, the property benefited from improvements that the Crown will enjoy in perpetuity, funded initially by public money. These individual cases, Sunninghill Park, Frogmore Cottage, they're not aberrations. They're examples of how the system works. Property is provided to family members. Public funds or duchy funds pay for maintenance and improvements. The family members benefit from private use of valuable properties. When they leave or sell, they sometimes profit privately from assets that were improved with public money. And when criticism arises, there are minor reforms, repayments under pressure, but the fundamental system remains unchanged. Now let's talk about the future. King Charles has made noises about slimming down the monarchy, reducing the number of working royals, making the institution more efficient and cost-effective. On the surface, this sounds like reform, like modernization. But look at what it actually means for property. Fewer working royals means fewer people entitled to publicly funded residences. That sounds good, but it also means more properties becoming available for private use or private income generation. If an apartment at Kensington Palace is no longer occupied by a minor royal, what happens to it? Does it open to the public? Does it generate rental income? Does it get sold and the proceeds added to private wealth? Charles's vision of a slimmed-down monarchy probably means a smaller core of working royals supported publicly, with extended family members pushed into more private roles. But those extended family members still have connections, still have access to properties through family arrangements, still benefit from the wealth networks we've been discussing. Slimming down the public face of the monarchy doesn't necessarily mean reducing private wealth. It might just mean making that private wealth less visible, which from the family's perspective is an improvement. The properties we've discussed represent only what can be found through research, through property records, through investigative journalism. The hidden mansions, the properties owned through complex trusts, the international holdings managed through offshore structures, these are harder to document. But the pattern is clear. The royal family owns more than they acknowledge, benefits more than they admit, and has structured their wealth management to minimize public awareness while maximizing private benefit. And here's the thing that really should trouble people. This system could change. Parliament could pass laws requiring full disclosure of royal holdings. They could eliminate the inheritance tax exemptions. They could require that all income from duchy properties be treated as normal income for tax purposes. They could require that properties not in active use be sold or open to the public. They could demand real transparency, real accountability, real equality before the law. But they don't. And they don't because the monarchy still has enough political support, enough public affection, enough symbolic power that challenging their wealth management is seen as too risky, too controversial. Politicians don't want to be seen as attacking the monarchy. Media outlets don't want to alienate readers who love the royal family. And the public, by and large, doesn't know enough about the details to demand change. So the system persists. The properties remain hidden or obscured. The wealth grows. The family maintains their public role while enjoying private privileges that no other family in Britain could dream of. And every year that passes, every generation that inherits wealth tax-free, every property that appreciates in value, the disparity grows wider. There are apologists who will argue that the royal family earns their wealth, that the Duchy of Cornwall and Duchy of Lancaster are well-managed enterprises that generate income through legitimate business activities. And on one level, that's true. The duchies are professionally managed. They make smart investments. They maintain properties well. But that argument misses the point. The duchies exist because of medieval royal prerogatives. They benefit from tax exemptions no other business gets. They've accumulated land over centuries through royal privilege, through grants and inheritances that were only possible because of the family's position. The playing field isn't level. It never has been. And managing inherited wealth effectively doesn't justify the inheritance itself. Others will argue that royal wealth is good for Britain, that the properties and land the family owns are better maintained than they would be in other hands, that the family's stewardship protects historical assets and natural landscapes. And again, there's some truth to this. Balmoral's forests are well managed. Sandringham's estates are maintained to high standards, but this argument assumes that only the royal family can be trusted with such stewardship, that there's no alternative between royal ownership and careless exploitation. That's obviously false. There are thousands of well-managed estates in Britain, historical properties protected through the National Trust, nature preserves maintained by conservation organizations. Wealth and environmental stewardship aren't the same thing, and conflating them is a rhetorical trick designed to make royal privilege seem like public benefit. The most honest defense of royal wealth is simply that it's traditional, that it's how things have always been done, that changing it would be too disruptive, too controversial, too likely to undermine an institution that still has value for Britain. And that's at least an argument made in good faith. But tradition isn't a moral justification. Things have been done in many ways throughout history that we've since recognized as unjust. The question isn't whether royal wealth is traditional, but whether it's right. Whether in a modern democracy with significant inequality, it makes sense to maintain a system that allows one family to accumulate and preserve extraordinary wealth with minimal taxation and limited accountability. These are hard questions without easy answers. Reasonable people can disagree about the value of the monarchy, about whether the costs are justified by the benefits, about whether radical reform or complete abolition is the right path forward. But what's not acceptable is the current situation where most people don't even know the full extent of royal wealth, where the properties and assets are deliberately obscured, where public awareness is managed rather than informed. The hidden mansions matter not just because they represent wealth inequality, though they do. They matter not just because they raise questions about fairness and taxation, though they do that too. They matter because they represent a fundamental lack of transparency in an institution that claims to serve the British public. The royal family asks for public support, for public funding for their official duties, for public deference to their position and status. In return, the public deserves honesty, full disclosure, real accountability. And that's not what they're getting. Every property we've discussed, every trust and company and offshore arrangement represents a choice to hide rather than reveal, a choice to minimize taxation rather than contribute fully, a choice to preserve private wealth rather than prioritize public good. These are choices made deliberately, strategically, over decades and centuries, and they've been successful. The Windsor family is one of the wealthiest families in Europe. Their wealth continues to grow, and most people have no idea of its full extent. This isn't a conspiracy. It's not illegal. It's not even secret in the truest sense, because if you have the time and expertise to dig through property records, to trace corporate structures, to follow investment trails, you can find much of this information. But it's obscured, made difficult, kept out of easy reach for ordinary people who don't have the time or resources to investigate. It's transparency in form, but not in substance. Disclosure that reveals as little as possible while technically complying with legal requirements. And that should bother you. It should bother you that a family in a democracy, in a nation built on principles of equality and fairness, can accumulate and preserve wealth on this scale while paying minimal taxes and operating with minimal oversight. It should bother you that properties exist specifically to be hidden from public view, maintained at great expense, used occasionally by a single family while the nation faces housing shortages and economic struggles. It should bother you that the system is explicitly designed, to make sure you don't know about any of this unless you go looking. The hidden mansions of the Windsor family aren't just buildings. They're symbols of a broader truth about wealth and power, about how privilege perpetuates itself, about how traditional institutions can survive in modern democracies by adapting just enough to deflect criticism while changing as little as possible in substance. They're reminders that what you're shown is often very different from what actually exists, that official narratives rarely tell the full story, that power protects itself through opacity and complexity. So the next time you see footage of the royal family at Balmoral or Sandringham or any of the official residences, remember what you're not seeing. Remember the properties that don't appear in the photographs, the estates that aren't mentioned in the official communications, the wealth that flows invisibly through trusts and companies and offshore structures. Remember that what's visible is just the surface, just the part they want you to see. And remember that beneath that surface lies an empire of hidden wealth that contradicts everything the family claims about themselves. They're not simple public servants. They're not living modestly. They're operating one of the most sophisticated wealth management systems in the world, and they're doing it with your support, whether you realize it or not.